Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 18, Human Complexity and Performance. All right, this is a bonus lecture after chapter 6, but it still carries around the theme of performance. But let's recall what we covered in lecture 17, where we went over the challenges associated with performance appraisals. We talked mostly about bias and error, and so we had several slides about the various biases and error. You might remember like the halo effect and attribution error and those sorts of things. And then we talked about what are some ways in which you can avoid them, or at least mitigate them, be aware of them, certainly, when you're doing performance appraisals. And then we sort of talked about the bottom line, which is that nobody really likes performance appraisals. Organizations are always trying to somehow improve them, and nobody has a better idea. All right, today is human complexity. There's that word again, complexity, and performance. So we'll start by talking about aspects of the job that aren't necessarily covered by your performance appraisal, that you may or may not be aware of it, but certainly the organization is not formally aware of it, and so therefore it's implicit at some level. And we're then going to talk about self-narratives and how that interplays with your personal performance, your motivation, what you think of your performance, and how that might actually drive good and bad, sometimes ineffective, behaviors in the workplace. And then we're going to get into what is productivity. Productivity is usually, or something akin to productivity is usually what an organization, certainly a profit-driven organization, ultimately is trying to get at. If you're doing things for the organization, how can you be maximally productive? Well, let's pick that scab a little bit. Let's try to deconstruct that word a little bit and that concept and see that that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. And it's important to understand that subtlety. Then we'll talk about the phenomenon that we all have of comparing ourselves to others and how that can be good and bad, and sort of some of the ways in which we do it. And we'll end today's lecture talking about agency and hierarchy. All right, let's get going about implicit job. So by now the term implicit should be old hat to you, right? Implicit and explicit, and something that's explicit is something that you can explain. Something that is implicit is something that definitely exists. You're aware of it, at least at the level of the whole pattern, so to speak. But the implicit part is the part that you either aren't explaining, or that you don't even know that the parts within the whole exist, and so that you might not even be able to explain it. But nonetheless, it's still there. So the implicit job. So start with should be no surprise that this job analysis that we've talked about, and making job descriptions, and then having making critical incidents, having your subject matter experts define things like critical incidents, defining all the KSAOs, your knowledge and your skills and your abilities and your other characteristics. So a whole bunch of people spend a bunch of time defining what it is that you do as a job. No big surprise, it's a reduction. It's a reduction of something much more complex. It is inevitably incomplete and imperfect, and yet we have to build performance appraisals around them, and we inevitably tend to think of our own performance often framed in these imperfect job analysis derived descriptions of what is our role, and then we miss so much more. So details get mixed, sort of intangibles, which is to say things you're definitely doing, roles that you could be doing or are doing, that may be very valuable. They just get ignored, at least officially ignored because they aren't in the job analysis, they're not in the job description, they're not written into your performance appraisals. So they're for the most part something nobody ever talks about, and something that you might not even talk about or think about. Yeah, just that it might be something aspect of your job you might keep doing, but unless you stop and actually start thinking that, hey, there's more to my job than the job description. There's more to my job than what my boss defines and what says and what my boss, praises me for. If you don't consciously do that, you won't really have a good perspective. So the implicit job is very real, and it varies quite a bit in terms of how well an organization may have defined the key important things. In some cases, it could be pretty good, reasonably comprehensive. In other cases, it might not. It might seem like the organization doesn't have a clue at all about what the real value and what the real activities are of a role. So the descriptions, that is to say, the job descriptions that come from the job analysis, those they fit the framework, and so the framework is more than just the job analysis. The job analysis is inevitably created within a frame of what the organization believes itself to be. If the organization is a business, and it maybe it's a product company that designs and builds and sells products, that inevitably creates a framework. Who we are, how good are we, what's our quality, what are we like, what's our culture. These sort of explicit things sort of define how you think about things. Sort of act like a kind of bounded rationality at the company cultural level that inevitably influences what you do and do not think about when you're doing something like a job analysis. So these constraints, this dimensional reduction, is actually in many layers. And I know this might be maybe word salad to some people or overly complicated, but this is a bonus lecture, so it's okay if certain parts of it are interesting and other parts aren't. And I certainly would love to hear about both of those things for extra credit. All right, so the other thing about the job, the job analysis is there, your job description is there, you're hired to do the job, you're trained to do the job, and then, months or years go by and inevitably things change. The work environment itself is inevitably dynamic because technology changes. The markets that you're, selling your goods or services in or whatever are changing. The business practices are evolving. People are always, FOMO is something that runs through a lot of organizations, always trying to adopt the best practice as it's believed to be. Business models evolve because you chase what you make money on, and even if you're not a profit-driven organization, you might be a non-profit driven organization. Well, funds are coming somewhere. Funds are coming in from donors, funds are coming in from government grants, and you inevitably end up evolving as an organization around where the funds are coming from and what kind of strings are tied to those funds. And so no matter what you are as an organization, there's evolution, there's drift, and the people within them come and go, and the people are changing as they're staying. So inevitably that makes a very dynamic environment, and that has a tendency to change, what people need and how you're interacting with people and the value that you create for your coworkers. And so inevitably implicit aspects of your job, or at least informal, they may be explicit to you. You may know very well that you do them because, they're tasks and you can't ignore them, but they're sort of implicit to the organization, or at least informal and not recognized by the organization. So inevitably this part exists, and inevitably this part tends to grow if you don't sort of do a reset and a new job analysis. Or what often happens is the person moves to a new job, might move up, might get promoted, might move laterally, and then a new person come in that doesn't have all the knowledge domain that built up all that implicit stuff, and it sort of resets to some other level. All right, so along those lines, people, niche finding is a thing that all, living agents, all living creatures that have to move and act in the world inevitably do, is find niches. And people are doing that in the workplace because the workplace is our environment. When we sort of grow into where we're needed, and that we find out what we're good at, and we find out what we like to do, and we also discover what it is that people think we're good at. And it's one thing to if you think you're good at something but all your coworkers don't. I mean, you won't get invited or asked to do those things necessarily. So over time, there's sort of a give and take between the people in an organization that helps you find your niche, hopefully, and also is involved in the changing, the evolution of that niche. And sometimes you can't catch everything, and you can and nor necessarily should you have to be always obsessing over. I just have additional responsibility that's not recognized by the organization. Things come and go, but oftentimes you don't really find out the full complexity, the full richness of what somebody was doing, especially if they've been in a job for a long time, especially if they were like well liked and thought highly of as very productive, high contributors, high performers, and then they leave. They retire, they quit, or they get promoted, whatever, and all of a sudden there's a gap. And not only does the formal, explicit things that this person was doing cease, and then you try to figure out if you're the manager, who do you assign to do those things, and how do you replace that person? But then a whole bunch of other stuff that was getting done ceases to get done. And sometimes that becomes abundantly clear right away. And sometimes it acts as a kind of ticking time bomb that months and months or years go by, where the neglect of that aspect of the person's job that was never defined, the neglect of that builds up to the point where there's some sort of crisis or what have you. And I've certainly seen this many times in my career where certain people weren't really recognized for their full talents, their full contribution, and then one day they quit or they retired or got a new job or whatever. And you go to try to replace that person, and you really suddenly feel the gap. You feel the missing, and a whole bunch of people come out of the woodwork going, "Hey, I heard Susan quit. She did this for us, and she always updated this for us. And who's going to do that?" And if you're the manager, you might go, "She was doing that too," and because it's really hard to keep up, especially if somebody's volunteers to do extra work. And another phenomenon that I've witnessed happen, multiple times in my career is along the lines of this: you don't understand the full worth of somebody until they've left. I've seen it happen, and I know this happens in almost every organization, where somebody was really good at their job, and actually working at a level that probably should have been treated as a higher level, higher pay grade, higher up the hierarchy, so to speak, job. And then but the person got, for whatever reason, the person wasn't fully recognized for that, and maybe that could be because the person was quiet, and just quietly went and did excellence and never tried to get any attention for it, and never complained until one day they'd had enough and they quit or whatever. And then the organization, starting with the manager or supervisor, has to replace that person. And then they really start to realize and finally get the proper perspective of, boy, this person, they really picked up a lot of knowledge over the years. And, I don't think we could actually replace this person with somebody that is at the same pay grade. We're going to have to bump this job up to backfill this person. We might have to bump it to a higher pay grade. And when that happens, that's a miss. I mean, that was an opportunity. If you could go back in time, there was an opportunity for the organization to recognize that somebody was actually performing at a higher level than what their job was. And if you can recognize that, and that usually just means more pay and a title that has something a little bit more fancier to it, or you go from a 1 or a 2 or a junior to a senior, at the end of it, or whatever. Titles are weird. But anyway, by recognizing that person performing at a higher level and presumably paying them more, you will often improve their engagement and improve their retention. But when you discover that the implicit job, the stuff that this person was performing, was significantly more than you thought, and you find that out by the hole left when the person left, and then to fill that hole, you need to hire somebody that's more expensive with at a higher pay grade. Shame on the whole system. It's impossible to have that never happen, and one shouldn't kick themselves or think that the whole thing doesn't work. If that happens, it happens, and there's a lot of factors in it, and some of the factors are the people themselves. If they are not self-advocates, And I would strongly encourage you to evaluate your own personality and your approach to things, and really think over your career. Are you properly advocating for yourself? And some of you are going to advocate too strongly. Some of you are going to be whiny and demanding and off-putting and a nuisance. And you'll think you need to move forward faster than you deserve. You'll think you need more pay, and you'll be kind of a thorn to your peers and your manager. But a lot more of you will be understated in your advocacy for. It will be sort of self-censoring and not wanting to. You don't want to look like you're demanding. You don't want to look like you're ungrateful. And sometimes you just sort of wait. I've seen it many, many times in my career where people they get increasingly frustrated that they're not being recognized for their performance, and they think that they could be at a higher pay grade or get promoted or become the manager somewhere or whatever. And yet, while they're getting increasingly frustrated, they don't say a word. Or if they do, it's really subtle, because they might be very introverted or indirectly communicating, or they might be just intimidated, or they might have really high doubt, and kind of imposter syndrome. That's on one end, and then you have the people that have the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they think they're smarter than they are, or they think they're more capable than they are, or they're just super confident and demanding. And those people need to rein it in and learn subtlety and learn indirectness and learn how to be seen as a high performer without whining, "Hey, I'm a high performer." But the other half, the people need to figure out how to be more of an advocate for themselves. So you got to really think about who you are, and you should seek input from trusted people that you're working with, and to get a real sense for yourself as best you can. And if you determine that you don't advocate for yourself enough, look into that. It's not hard to find books and YouTube videos or just watching other people, but definitely learn to fight for your own career in a productive, constructive, non-annoying or demanding way, and help your organization recognize the implicit part of your job as it grows. All right, what's next? Self-narratives. All right, so I don't know how long this lecture is going to be. So far, I'm tangenting it a few times, but these are important topics. So, a self-narrative. What's a self-narrative? Well, recall that the narrative itself is a metaphor for taking action in the world, embodied action in the world. It's abstracted. And language itself becomes these kind of associative proxies, so that we can communicate to other people, and to ourselves, an abstract thing that is akin to, and at some level of the brain, using the same architectures that were designed for embodied action in the world. We're doing that when we think about everything. At least that's a radical embodied viewpoint. It's what I think there's a future consensus for. Not everybody in psychology will agree with that, and just know that this is my perspective on things. Anyway, just like thinking about how your career is doing, or whether how your dog is doing. When the concept of self, which is a pretty complicated thing, there's a narrative usually associated with that, and you have things that you build up, that are often the memories that you have and your identities. An identity itself is a narrative, but an identity is often a narrative that also then ties you to some other structure. Usually that is like it might be an identity that's strictly a in-group identifier, like I'm a member of X group, and that's part of my identity. Or it can be more ramified, which is to say you're part of an in-group, but within that in-group there's people that have specialized roles, or they have recognized positions, And so your identity can be quite complicated. And again, we're complex human beings. We're a member of lots of in-groups. And you can have identities tied to all of your in-groups. It is not simply a thing of this is your gender or whatever. People have identities in the sense that they absolutely love anime, and that is a big part of their life, and they have an in-group of people that they meet at the comic store, and their part of their identity is they're sort of the most knowledgeable about some weird aspect of it. I mean, identity is a really complex thing itself, and then your memories get formed sort of around your identities, and vice versa. So they're reciprocal. So you tend to remember the things that are meaningful to you, the things that sort of taught you lessons, or the things that really lock in your narrative. So you have an infinite number of things you could have memorialized, so to speak. You're every day you're taking in, at the transduction level of your sensory nerves, you're taking in an insane amount of transient information that you are mostly ignoring, like 99 point who knows what percent ignoring, and the process of figuring out what part to let through, which is a process of inhibiting everything else, is how you actually experience the world. And you sort of sift through all of those things. So now those are just the things you're perceiving, and all the sensory input that never got to your consciousness that you've ignored. Now you have what limited signal has come out of there that you're perceiving. Only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that is ever going to be encoded as a memory. And then only a tiny, tiny fraction of those encoded memories become part of sort of a consolidated memory. Whether that's a consolidated episodic memory or a semantic memory. And the differences to that right now really don't matter. But the things that you lock down that are then become relatively easy to recall, and certainly the things you then recognize that are part of your memories, insanely tiny, 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 tiny fraction of what you experience, as well as what you experience abstractly, which is your thoughts. So when you're just sitting thinking about stuff, that's kind of like taking in sensory information. Most of that stuff just comes and goes. So what you have for your memories that are tied to your narrative of self are also insanely tiny. So I could go on that, and I don't think it would be that productive. So the important point to remember here is that while it might feel like your identity is sort of built by your life and your life experiences, you've been actually sort of self-curating, self-selecting, choosing to ignore all along, and sort of been an active participant, so to speak, in what you are going to then remember that are part of your self-narrative. So whether you know it or not, you're crafting your own self-narrative. I mean, some people do this very deliberately, and you can. I mean, you can kind of make a new you, but most, and that, for most people, it feels kind of false. And I don't mean to diminish people that choose to do that, because I mean it's legitimate. But most of us go through and we sort of reflect and come up with a narrative, and other people sort of tell us, and there's this back and forth to get to this sort of sense of self, and then this sense of self runs along the journey of life, with our bodies, and that self narrative often evolves, and I don't mean to be simple, like you have this one self narrative and it's this little fold out pamphlet that it's seldom something explicit that you can write down. But anyway, self concepts, they're narrative stories. Now, when you think about that, what do you choose to accept, so to speak, as part of your self narrative? Do you accept things that are difficult to process? Do you accept things that might be a painful truth? I'll never be 6'10" with insane coordination skills, or younger, so I'll never be a pro basketball player. I don't want to be, I don't care. But for some people, accepting some inherent limitations on of things they want to do is quite difficult. Maybe bringing it a little bit closer to home, it's tough for some people to accept that they might be the ones holding themselves back in their career more than what they're construing, the stories they confabulate about how, somebody else, the system, the organization, your boss, some system of oppression. And sometimes those things are spot on. Sometimes those things are, really causal, and they are your source of problem. But make sure you think hard about that, and make sure you aren't burying a painful truth. Make sure you haven't curated memories by eliminating things. For example, how talented are you in your job, and that's multidimensional. But how smart are you? How well do you remember things? When things get stressful and you have too much on your plate, do you have a tendency to hunker down, get it done, and stay calm, or do you have a tendency to kind of panic a little bit and want to get away from it? And that affects other people. And so when you experience things at work that don't go so well, how you internalize that, inevitably is a story. Okay, no matter what, it's a story. The question is how accurate can you make your story, or is your story so? And inevitably, it's a reduction. Inevitably, you have to choose what you're going to attribute, what you're going to make your story up as, in terms of why you didn't do so well on something, why your performance was low in an area. But be very cautious, and be humble, in the sense that don't be too confident in your construal, and ask yourself, okay, I didn't do well in this spot. Here's why I think I didn't do well. Did I just absolve myself of responsibility? Did I choose an explanation for my performance that blamed other people and not blamed me? Because that's easy. Okay, that's the path of pain avoidance. That's the path of anxiety avoidance, because now you don't have to deal with the fact that maybe I'm not who I thought I was. Maybe I'm not up to this job. Maybe I'm not ready. There's a lot of uncertainty and therefore a lot of anxiety. And if you can construe something and believe it, that makes that not a reality to you. Now that anxiety goes away. That feels better, because now you're in an environment where things are more certain. Be very careful about that. I've seen many, many times. Everybody does it. I do it. And I've watched people torpedo their career, or at least completely pigeonhole themselves into a corner where they can't move forward in their career. And boy, have they got a number of stories as to why it's absolutely not their fault. And you might, and before you put all your energy into blaming the other people or a system in terms of why your performance is viewed poorly, and why your performance was actually fine, but so-and-so took credit for the success and blamed you for the bad stuff, and nobody gives you a proper shot because of some aspect of yourself. Those things may be partially accurate. They may, might look at them and I know that's true because X and X and X, and I talked to so-and-so and they had the same thing happen. Okay. But the story you tell is inevitably a gross simplification. Is that the only factor? Is there aspects of the performance that you could have controlled? Fine. Just assume that the system's out to get you. Your boss wants to take all of the credit. If that were true, and if you feel that way, it's possible that could be partially true. But if it's true, does that mean that your proper response is to just, accept it, be bitter, and don't do anything? Or what were there other factors that you could have controlled? Are there things about yourself and your performance that you're avoiding dealing with because they're too painful? They create too much uncertainty, and they call into question your self-narrative. And you don't want to deal with that because you think you know who you are. And if you suddenly don't know who you are lost. That is That's the metaphor. That's literally the anxiety, where the anxiety comes from an embodied cognition standpoint, is when you discover that a narrative about yourself is no longer accurate. You now no longer know who you are, which is a way, and your narrative itself is this abstract, self-narratives are some ridiculously abstract thing, but they are tied to moving around in the world. And if you have the wrong narrative, you are actually on a wrong path. You don't know where you're at. So it is akin to, it feels very much like being lost. And now, if you're lost, you have a tremendous amount of uncertainty because you don't necessarily know where you're going because you don't know where you are. How can you know where you're going if you don't know where you are? And all sorts of bad things could happen. And a lot of anxiety, depression, all sorts of stuff can come with that. And so a lot of people will want to avoid that as much as possible. And so they avoid the painful truths about themselves. And it's always somebody else's fault. It's always somebody else's responsibility. And they refuse to acknowledge those painful truths because they don't want to deal with it. And so then they're stuck with it. And maybe, yeah, that's the path to being bitter, resentful, and not very successful. So what are the things you can control? Can you confront your painful truths, or are you construing something just to soothe yourself? That's a really, that may be the most important thing of this lecture. We'll see. There's a lot of stuff in here that I think is really important. So remember, you see what you want to see, and if you really don't want to see painful truths about you, you won't see them. And it's better to see them, deal with them, feel the pain, walk into it, come up with a different path, come up with a new story of who you are that accepts that and deals with it and maybe addresses it or builds a defense around it or builds other skills, whatever it is. But accept the things that appear to be true and move forward in life with that recognition. Another thing about self-narratives is are you an agent or are you part of a group? And it's not an either or, but you'll kind of go back and forth with these sort of feelings that are motivating you and impacting your decisions. So how focused are you on yourself and how focused are you on your team? And if you have a high agency, you're obsessed with your own sovereignty, so to speak, as opposed to communion, as opposed to affiliative, as opposed to towards the larger group. If you're really self-focused, you can actually lose sight of the bigger picture because the organization you work for is part of team, and it's a team of teams. And if your self-narrative is too much about yourself and not enough about the team, you'll be trying to be a hero all the time, trying to get the spotlight all the time, and it might win a few times, but more often than not, it'll eventually start to limit your success because the team won't be behind you. Now, the opposite is also possible, which is you can have a self-narrative that is overly sort of servant-minded or nurturing-minded or support-minded, and you can be super team-focused and very self-sacrificial and never want to take credit for stuff and never speak up about what you want, and always team-focused. And that can be very good for the team, but it's not always that good for you. You want to have a little bit of agency and self-focus. You want to be able to make sure you're advocating for yourself within the system so that the system recognizes your value and that you move forward. So it's not, you shouldn't be either or, and where you should be balanced between these two things changes by context. But these are things to be aware of and be aware of how you tie your self-narratives to these things. Another thing is really important is what's your mindset? Do you think that you're set? That you have your skills, you have your knowledge, you're as smart as you're going to be, and you're as capable as you're going to be, and it's just a matter of trying to figure out how to go through life that way? Or do you have a mindset that things are fluid, that your skills, your knowledge, even your intelligence ebbs and flows, and that there's things you can do to actually improve it? And do you have a growth mindset? Are you the person where things happen to you, or are you somebody that makes things happen? Are you the agent in your own life? Or does the world impose itself upon you? And again, there are times in which the world definitely imposes itself upon you. But don't go to the point where you just feel like you're fixed and you're buffeting by the winds. and you just sit there and wait for things to happen for you in your career. You recognize that you are an agent in your own life, have a growth mindset, and take action. All right, let's talk about productivity. What do we mean by value-added activity? And that may or may not be a new term for you, but a lot of organizations will use it. If you work for an organization that makes products and sells products, the thing that adds value is whatever is actually making that product and putting it in the hands of the customer, and then the customer is paying you for it. There's a lot of other activity that's around inspecting things and doing accounting and doing all sorts of stuff to enable that, but that's not the direct value add. And so we don't want to get deep in the weeds here. But there's a lot of things that an organization has to do that isn't part of its core, but it's critical to just maintaining the overall infrastructure, the overall functioning of the organization. So what do we mean by productivity? If you are insanely good at inspecting, you're the greatest inspector that ever existed, and boy, do you work your butt off. That every widget that your company makes in the factory, you take that widget and you look at it insanely well, and check it for everything, and then it goes back in a box and goes to the customer, and you do that your whole life. Well, what if you never found a defect? Because it turns out that not only are you insanely dedicated to the inspection of your widgets, what if your widget making process is also insanely good that you never make a bad widget? So what did you do your whole career? It's sort of a silly example, but were you adding value? If one in 3 widgets was bad, and you stopped all those from going to the customer, and then people were able to look at it and go, crap, we're making a lot of bad widgets, let's fix this. Now you have something you can tie to that improve the organization. So what does productivity mean? What does value add mean? These are complicated things, and productivity ends up being in the eye of the beholder to some extent. Here's a big part of that kind of gets rolled up into productivity, and some of this depends upon sort of the perspective or the eye of the beholder of, say, your supervisor, or in some cases how your organization thinks. There's a difference between working hard and working smart. There's a difference between just being really conscientious and something like innovating. If you have a giant pile of rocks and you're supposed to move it from point A to point B, is the best thing to do to get a little tiny shovel and one scoop at a time, move it over from point A to point B? Or would it be better to take a little bit of time and find a wheelbarrow, so that you're not carrying the tiny shovel from that whole distance all the way to A to B and B to A? And instead of doing that, maybe that shovel is so small that it takes 50 loads to fill the big wheelbarrow. Well, that's 50 times you went back and forth at A and B versus one time on the wheelbarrow. And you'll save all of that if you stop for a minute and not work so hard and work smart. Now, if you refuse to work hard because you don't want to, and you don't come up with that innovation, that's a problem. So there's a balance there, and people end up on different dimensions here, different dimensions of conscientiousness, and different areas of openness, and that tends to drive whether their mindset is just let's get to work, or their mindset is, well, work sucks, there's got to be an easier way, but no, let's spend some effort to find that easier ways and improve our productivity. So what's more productive? Just getting in there and getting it done, or stopping thinking and spend a little bit of time on the lazy solution that might actually in the end save a lot of time. So it depends. Another thing on productivity is problem admiration versus problem admiration versus solution admiration. Some people, I've got a lot of degrees and a lot of my coals in a lot of fires, and it's tough to answer the question, what do I do? But ultimately, the one thing I always consider myself is an engineer. Ironically, I manage engineers and actually don't do a whole lot of engineering. I could argue that the people that work for me will probably say I don't do any. But nonetheless, that's probably the core of my work identity, is that I consider myself an engineer before I consider myself a scientist. I don't know if I consider myself more of a material scientist versus social scientist. It doesn't matter. But I am definitely an engineer. And one thing about engineers is that they definitely can fall into problem admiration versus solution admiration. And the problem, and so can organizations. So can in some cases tech companies in terms of the culture within it. A problem admiration is really so it's kind of a self-narrative. It's also sort of a group narrative. It's also a kind of competence hierarchy of how well you can handle difficult stuff. This is super, super complicated, but I'm smart enough and I can handle complexity enough that I can get my head around it. I've spent a lot of time working in the electronics industry, and there's a whole hell of a lot of complexity to electronics. Besides the hardware and software, I mean, there's just layers and layers. And when you talk about computing, embedded systems, and what a computer is, and you might talk about what a microprocessor is, and all of the abstraction layers on it, and then all of the layers on software. It's ridiculously complicated. So somebody that's got a lot of problem admiration, or an organization that has a lot of problem admiration, thinks really highly of people that can navigate that complexity. Well, one thing that can happen with too much problem admiration is, why make it? We don't have to make it simpler. We don't have to make it easier. We don't have to come up with some solution that cuts through all of that, because we understand it. And sometimes too much problem admiration can have too many resources, too many people, too many humans, too much time, too much money spent just in that really complex system. Where if you have more solution admiration, which is you're really focused on improving things, not on understanding things. Okay, as engineers like to do both. Engineers like to solve problems, but engineers often like really complex problems, and they often admire a problem if they can when they can get their head around it. But admiring the solution usually drives more innovative behavior, and you want to be careful to not. This may or may not be you. But you definitely, if it isn't, definitely look for it in other people. Some people just revel into being able to get it, to be able to understand this complexity, and then when they're in that complexity, the urge to make it simpler for the new guy, or you or whatever, is gone, because they get it, they understand it. So solution admiration drives innovation. Problem admiration is good if there are no solutions. Okay, there's no easier way of doing it. And to some extent, the problem admiration and solution admiration is a sort of a more complex manifestation of the whole conscientiousness versus innovation. All right, so it's sort of the difference between, are you really smart? Oh, look at me, I can understand this complex thing. I'm such a smart person. I feel really good about myself. All my other really smart engineer friends, admire me because I'm the one that can handle the most gnarly, complex thing. Well, okay. What did that do? How effective did that matter? What's the solution? What are you getting to the customer? So different things. Another thing is productivity metrics, and this is like, how much work did you do? How good were your deliverables? Did you meet your deadlines on time, or whatever? There's all sorts of ways to complexify this, to try to figure out how to measure someone's productivity. But inevitably, it's going to be gamed. If it's tied to your performance, it will change behaviors, and it'll change how you report those behaviors to make sure that your metric shows up well. And so what gets measured gets managed. That's a saying in organizations, and it's true. If you measure it and then attach importance to it, that's the thing that gets looked at to be managed. It's like when tests became very important in K through 12 in the United States, and getting good test scores, and how sometimes federal funds are sort of tied to maintaining good test scores. Over time, the priorities of the teaching ended up being teaching to the test as opposed to teaching to the skills. So as opposed to trying to educate people for life, you end up trying to make sure you get good test scores. So sometimes they're the same things. A good test score means you're ready for life, but sometimes they're different enough that you lose focus. So productivity metrics are squirrely things, and they inevitably get gamed. All right, so let's talk about another aspect that affects performance, and that is, and it's certainly related to your self-narrative, but it's also then tied to where you position yourself within the group, and just this phenomenon of comparing yourself to others. Now think about this example here. What would you rather have? would you rather have a 5% raise, but you're the highest paid member of your team, or would you like a 10% raise, but you're the lowest paid on your team? And you might think, right now, well, I don't wish any ill of my team. If I got a 10% raise and say all my other team members got 15% raise, I'd still be happy. I'd love the 15, but 10 is better than 0. I'd definitely take that. Would you? Long term, because you're the change, because you got that raise, you'll get over that. You'll get over the fact that you're now making more money, and it'll now be the normal amount of money you make, and then now you'll start going back to comparing yourself to your coworkers, and you might find, if somebody checked back in with you, 6 months, a year or two later, that you're actually a little bit more upset that you're the lowest paid person, and because you might not think you're the least productive. But if you got the 5% raise and everybody else got like a 1% raise, you'd feel pretty good about that. Who knows? Everybody's a little bit different there, but there have been, some studies that look at these choices. And for the most part, how we feel about something like a raise is, it's different, again, if you can't pay your bills. Okay, again, the whole correlation between stress and pay, it correlates tightly until you make enough money, and then it starts to correlate less strongly. But anyway, you inevitably are comparing yourself to others, and oftentimes there's these prestige hierarchies you throw on top of things, and what you make is certainly important to the bills you have to pay, but it also tends to be a kind of measure of how well you're doing, and it's quite normal to sort of think about how well you're doing compared to others. So these are complex things, and we cannot help ourselves to rank people, and this includes ourselves. And it should be, this is not a singular thing, okay? And don't take, when I'm talking about hierarchy, don't take a unidimensional view of this. This isn't like there's only one hierarchy. There's an infinite number of hierarchies because we're humans and we create them. There may be a kind of sort of baked-in apparatus that almost always expresses itself, that is tied to genetics as a social animal, as a social mammal, where hierarchy inevitably emerges because we're competing for resources and mates and that sort of thing. But the kinds of hierarchies that manifest in human cultures are there's a myriad ways they manifest, and they are not all about who's strongest by any means. In fact, that they're outside of maybe teenage boys, they're rarely ever, or competitive sports, they're hardly ever around physicality. But we inevitably seem to find ways to stack ourselves and compare ourselves. And that may even be who's the best looking, who's the, or at least are you better looking than this person or that person? Where are you in that thing? And how is your confidence? What's your charisma like? What's your intelligence? How well do you remember things? Are you the person that remembers names really well or not? And Bob, or Rachel, she just always seems to remember everybody's names, and it just seems to be a big advantage, and I can't. We think these things. Some people really ruminate and really obsess over it, and some people barely ever think about it, so this isn't like some fixed thing. But comparing ourselves is definitely a thing humans do, again, across many, many dimensions. But the part that matters from from a performance standpoint is to think about what do you do when you make these comparisons of yourself to others? Does it lead to productive behavior? Does it lead to you ruminating and getting a bunch of anxiety, or does it lead to you putting a construal so you don't have to think about a painful truth? How do you respond to that? And I can't sit and tell you how you should respond because every circumstance is highly contextually dependent. But it's good to have a self-check here to recognize that you're going to do this, and to recognize that when you see something you don't like, that so-and-so is better looking than me. Okay, maybe not a big work thing. But does your next response be to cut them down, to look for a flaw? So, and did you do that because somehow now that makes you feel better? Okay, what have you done? How have you really improved the world? Or is it better to acknowledge that, and then instead of cutting that person down in your mind, think about, okay, maybe I'm not as attractive in this respect with that person, but here are some things about me that aren't that bad. In fact, I can work on a couple of these things, and beauty only lasts so long, and so I can hold on to these things, and I can grow these things, so that's okay. I'm not that disadvantaged by it. Whatever it is. The point is, when you're making these comparisons, watch where you go. Watch that you don't, even if it's in your mind, and certainly watch about doing it out loud in front of other people. Of cutting somebody down because they have a better one small dimension out of a million that they're better than you at. Are you think of it more synergistically, think of it more additively, think of it more supportively, and accept things if they appear to be true. We can't ever truly know truth, but we could certainly avoid something that looks like it might be true that we don't like. So if you think you're the smartest person, now you have somebody on the team that, boy, that person's really sharp, and now you feel inadequate. Well, if you've envisioned yourself always as like the smartest person in the room, and now you have to face the reality that maybe you're not, you might not want to do that. And it might be easier to figure out ways in which that person isn't that, in order to protect yourself. And just watch yourself and ask yourself, is that really am I making up a story in order to feel good? And is that in my best interest in the long term? All right, so I don't have there's no great template to follow on this other than play it out in your mind and be aware of these tendencies, and to not be expedient, to take responsibility for things, to think the long term, and avoid expediency. And you can Google that word if you want. Okay, the last slide we have is agency and hierarchy. So hierarchical distance and culture. What does that mean? So in the West, historically and currently, in a lot of Eastern cultures, we had more hierarchical distance than we have now. What does that mean? How often you would say sir or ma'am, whether or not you can speak up to somebody that is in a position of authority, what titles you use, in some cases, in certain cultures, depending on, even if you go way back for sure, whether you can make eye contact, whether you can be in the same place. There are a lot of ways in which there was high hierarchical distance, and in today's world there are definitely cultures, especially some, and there's been some good studies on this. There's some interesting books on this topic that is compared like East to West, and the hierarchical distance of the East versus the West, and the informality of the West and the formality of the East, and the good and the bad, but just the difference. There is a kind of emerging, arguably an emerging global culture, or at least a sort of shallow global culture that is influencing everybody's culture because of the ridiculous amount of content that is now promulgating the interwebs. A lot of them are American inventions. So to some extent, we are experiencing a global a sort of Americanization. And at the same time, America is certainly being influenced, but it does appear to be more one way than the other. So one of the things that is likely going to be, if we continue to be an interconnected world, we'll likely see hierarchical distance in many cultures, continue to diminish. And I've certainly seen it in my lifetime. My name's Todd, by the way, and if you see me on campus, you can say hi, Todd, and that's cool. But when I was an undergrad a long time ago, there would be professors that, you would say Dr. Smith or Professor Smith, and if you didn't, boy, you're disrespectful. And now if a professor were to, not always, but if a professor were to correct you and say it's Dr. Smith, you'd be like, oh, aren't you somebody? And that's hierarchical distance, and that is what's at play here is the performative actions by which somebody acknowledges a hierarchy, and with things like deference, and who gets to be rude, sort of who gets to be and it's not rude if it's accepted, right? So who gets to be real directive and curt, and who has to be differential. A lot of that historically would come from where you were in a hierarchy, and that hierarchy could be a cultural hierarchy based on wealth, or where you were born, and there's certainly ugly elements to this that affected characteristics of people that we know about as a painful part of our history. But today we tend to have this countering force where we really push against too much hierarchical distance. Your supervisor at work is not a better person than you. They're not more moral. Their life isn't worth more than yours. Each individual in our society is of the same moral worth, and a great deal of our cultural value system is built around that. And so how do we balance the need for an organization of people to work in an aligned manner? So if you have 1,000 people in an organization and they all want to do their own thing, you don't have an organization. Okay, you just have 1,000 people doing their own thing. In order to actually have an organization act in a coherent manner, there needs to be some give and take. Somebody needs to have decision rights over certain things. And you can't spend every single moment on every single decision voting. Maybe you might do that for certain key things, but you need to cede authority at certain levels in order for the ship to move, and to move in one direction, and not have everybody trying to pull it in different ways. So authority, decision rights, and hierarchy become the mechanism by which a group of otherwise unaligned people agree together. They agree to the structure. They agree to the collective fiction that so-and-so's in charge of this or that, and then now it becomes true because everybody accepts it. That structure, that is a cultural construction, becomes recognized as though it is real, and everybody acts like it's real, and now you've got a hierarchy with authority and decision rights. So you need to have that in order for an organization to function properly, in order for people to act in a way that's predictive. They have to go, okay, I can trust the organization, I can trust the person to do these sorts of things, and I'm going to pay attention to my part, and I don't have to pay attention to everything, and so we can be efficient to move forward here. But if you only do that, you can find yourself in a situation where those decision rights that you've now split into, that you've stratified, and the authority that comes from that, and then the sharing of the wealth, so to speak, where the higher ups often get more of the share of the cream. If you don't counter that can infect the entire culture, and you can have what we've often had in historic cultures, and certainly historically in the West, and in many cultures still today. So one of the things that we often do to counter that is deliberately do performative things that run counter to that. So you call the CEO of an organization is usually talked to within the organization by their first name. And then, deliberately, often a CEO of an organization will like play a role of being super accessible and no better than no different than the lowest paid person in the organization. Now, is that really true? No, the CEO is making a ridiculous multiple of whatever the lowest paid person is. and is a lot less likely to ever be in a position where they're not, where they have to worry about medical bills and all sorts of that stuff. All of those things are true, but in order to keep those inequities from being too dehumanizing, and in order to keep them from becoming structured in our culture writ large, there's a lot of things that we've created as a culture that to run counter to that. So that's the whole notion of equality. That's the whole notion of the dignity and the worth, the value of every human individual. That value system and the narratives that are built up around that are a nice counterweight to the inevitable hierarchies you have to have in order to have aligned action as a group. And it's a really super fascinating subject, and learning about the cultural differences in hierarchical distance is also a absolutely fascinating subject. And so you want to balance hierarchy with agency. You want to balance how much, it's kind of like decision rights, how much of your own daily life do you get to decide, and how much do you cede to somebody who has a hierarchical authority to you, over you as your supervisor, and what's the right balance of that. And so this is an interesting thing to think about. Is and again, it's productivity. It's how to help with your productivity, but it's also something to reflect on and what makes an organization most effective. You can think of autonomy as the more autonomous you are, the more decision rights that you have. That doesn't mean that you work alone. It just means that you get to make your own decisions. And if you're going to have autonomy, what's the corrective action that keeps you from just doing something completely different? And that corrective action is accountability. So if you're going to be given decisions over what you do for your project or whatever at work, the organization needs to also hold you accountable in your performance to those decisions. So if you make a bunch of wrong decisions and it doesn't go well for the company, it has to reflect in your performance, your ability to get a raise, your ability to get promoted, and that sort of thing. And so the autonomy should be balanced by and matched by accountability. Then it creates kind of a feedback improvement loop. And that's a good way to balance agency versus hierarchy, because especially in an individual-centric egalitarian society like the West, and especially in America, and a lot of this is an ongoing struggle with organizations and tendencies of human beings to want to take it upon themselves as the authority, as the supervisor, as the manager, to keep decision rights, and to not allow their people to have too much autonomy. But if you give them autonomy and you give them accountability, you do create a corrective feedback loop. You should never give autonomy without accountability, because then there's no consequence for people to make crappy decisions. And you should absolutely never give accountability without autonomy, because that's holding people accountable for something that they didn't have the decision rights for. Like if it was your call to do something and it didn't go well, you don't punish your people for that. And so one of the things with accountability is, if you as the leader, as a supervisor, manager, or whatever, don't give your people, don't recognize the autonomy, don't impede the autonomy, and allow people to be accountable and relatively autonomous. If you do that, you enable them to develop mastery. You enable them to get really, really, really good at their job, because they also had to live with their decisions. And so they have a deeper perspective, and they make better decisions in the future, and they become more effective. So don't rob people of their opportunity for mastery. And so in order to do that, in order to make people autonomous, to help with their performance, you want to hold them accountable. But it doesn't mean just because they make an error you fire them. So when is it right to let people fail, and when is it not a good idea? And if you're not going to let them fail, that means you have to be in the middle of that decision. You have to like put an approval layer. So you can't make a decision. You can't decide on the dimensions of the product or whatever. That has to go to me, or that has to go to the group, or whatever. that means if there's a failure, that those people don't internalize that and know whose fault it is, and now you've lost an opportunity for mastery. But at the same time, you don't want to necessarily give people the decision rights for something that could sink the whole company. I mean, you want to use perspective on this. So when can failure be a teachable moment? And I would say when the failure doesn't bring down the whole business. You want to, you kind of think of this as, when you're raising children, and how much room you give them to fall down, and so that they learn, and you don't want to necessarily be there to catch them every single time, or they actually don't learn how to be resilient. So don't rob people of their failures either. And then something to think about, and this is definitely something to think about for yourself, is do some people, fear their own agency? Do they want to actually give away a lot of their autonomy? Because what they don't like, as much as they might like the autonomy, what they don't like is the accountability. They don't like having to deal with the consequence, and because sometimes those consequences aren't good, and then that creates uncertainty for their future decisions. And that uncertainty, nobody likes uncertainty, right? So that's a thing that you tend to avoid. And some people avoid it way too much, and they don't want to have any agency. They sort of clip their own wings. And you watch yourself and watch other people, and then if you see other people doing that, see what you can do to get them to understand why they're limiting themselves. Don't be afraid to. If you want to learn how to fly, you have to be able to push through the fear of falling. You really need to embrace the possibility of failure, and you need to think of failure as a teacher. So one important lesson here as we finish. So you may or may not have done weightlifting in your life, but you probably understand the general concept that you go in the gym, you push heavy weights, you try to push as much as you can, so to speak, without injuring yourself. But by pushing hard and barely making the number of reps in a set, you bring on a cascade of physiological events that cause your body to build up larger muscles. And we won't get into any of those details other than the broader concept, which is by pushing yourself and making physical demands of yourself, your body has these mechanisms to say, oh, this is a thing I need to do in the environment. I'd better start the gene expression mechanisms that create the proteins that build up more muscle, and all the other complexities associated with that. A way of looking at that is you don't get stronger without feeling weak. So you don't. If you're in the gym and you're pumping iron, and you get to rep number 8, and you wanted to get to 10, and you're really pushing yourself, and you barely can make rep number 9, and you fail rep number 10, you feeling weak. But people generally understand that by experiencing that weakness, by pushing yourself to the physical edge of what you're currently able to do, by embracing weakness and pushing through it, by taking action in the face of that weakness. That is how you make yourself stronger. So people should, for the most part, understand that. Like, you want to learn how to run long distance? Well, run long distance. And you'll feel like super tired and awful, and you want to stop, and you got to embrace that feeling and push through it. And if you want to develop the physiological response to improve your vasculature and the innervation of your slow twitch muscles and yada yada, so that you have better endurance in the future, and increase the number of mitochondria you have, and a whole bunch of other interesting stuff that happens when you're trying to improve your endurance. And keep in mind, we're human beings. Okay, we're not built like we don't have nearly the strength of chimps or apes. Okay, we made tools, and our hunters ran down ungulates. Okay, we have insane endurance. Just ridiculous. And we have unbelievably good thermal regulation capacities. So the next time you're trying to run 3 miles or even 1 mile and you're all exhausted, if you're a healthy person, it is ridiculous what you're really capable of, but you have to push through that feeling of tiredness. If you want to have stamina, you got to push through the tired. If you want to have strength, you got to push through the weak. All right, let's come back full circle to the bullet here. If you want to get smarter, you have to feel dumb. If you want to have power in your life, if you want to have power over your own life, you have to accept and embrace and deal with the uncertainty and the potential failure of your own decisions. And this is a very powerful lesson for how you look at yourself in order to become a top performer. Is, are you actually afraid? And are you holding yourself back? And this is especially this, you don't get smarter without feeling dumb. You ever, we're working on, probably had math a few times in your life. You may be a math major for all I know, but some of you are probably like, I'm glad I don't have to do any more math. Well, if you're doing math and you ever get to that point where you go, God, I don't get this. This is so hard. What do you do in that moment? Because now you're feeling dumb. If you withdraw from it, because I don't like feeling that. I don't like feeling this uncertainty because I can't navigate through this. I'm going to pull away from it and avoid it. And now, okay, I hate math and I stay away from math. Okay, well, okay, yeah, you'll never be good at math. But if instead you accept that feeling of, I can't get this, and you stay in that, and you don't withdraw from that, you walk into that feeling of, I can't get this. That actual feeling, that effortful action of trying to figure something out, and it isn't all math. It could have happened to you a few times in this lecture, trying to disambiguate my word salad. Okay, if you don't withdraw from that, if you keep your brain engaged, if you're in the workplace and you're dealing with complicated stuff, and you're like, I don't know anything about this. I don't like this. This is hard. I just walk away from it. If instead you go, how does this work, and you walk towards it metaphorically, effortful thinking that's trying to figure something out, that is in some sense sort of goal oriented, that actually is what triggers neuroplasticity in order to build new connections to become more efficient in those neuronal loops and those neuronal networks in the future. So the way you get smarter, the way you learn more skills, the way your KSAOs, okay, the way you develop capability in your job or skateboarding. But this is a performance topic, so the way you get really good at your job is by finding those moments where you're trying to figure something out that's kind of complicated, and watch yourself. And when you don't like it, because it's hard, and you're trying to figure it out, don't walk away from that. Don't avoid that. Okay, approach that, and recognize that feeling of feeling stupid is actually a message. It's a physiological message. It's very old, that your brain is sending, that says, okay, there's something I got to do here. I got to rewire myself to get good at it, and that will take energy and resources. Are we sure we want to use those resources? That's a big concept here. It's the same thing when you're trying to run a few miles and you don't have endurance and you feel exhausted. That's your body going, okay, we do actually have the reserves to do this, but this is going to cost you a lot of precious calories. And your body is a product of millions of years of evolution in a world that didn't have high fructose corn syrup, didn't have the ridiculous food surplus that you have as an American right now. And so you have a very old evolved system that's very conservative about its use of resources. So it's warning you. Are you sure? And you got to push through that, because you have way more. Typically, if you're a healthy person, have way more reserves than that. And the same thing when you can't quite figure something out, your brain is going, okay, I'll need a fair amount of calories burned in order to build up the structures so that this action can be less effortful in the future. It better be really important, and it better be critical for you to do this, for us to use those resources. So I'm giving you this feeling of effort, because if it isn't that important, you'll walk away from it, and therefore preserve your precious food stores or your fat stores or whatever. So you're better prepared for the famine next time, so to speak, because that's what your systems have evolved. That's the environment that your systems evolved in. So think about that. Maybe replay it again and think about it, because this is also an incredibly important thing that could be a real life changer to you if you understand it. Walk into that feeling, approach that feeling. Don't avoid that feeling. The feeling of I feel stupid. If it's the right kind of effortful, I'm trying to figure this out, You're literally engaging neuroplasticity, and that uncomfortable feeling of this is hard, that is simply your body warning you that it'll take calories in order to build up these neuronal structures. And we got right now anyway, thankful we have plenty of, for good and for bad, we have plenty of food, so embrace that. Not the food, the feeling of being dumb, in order so that you can become smarter. All right, do not run away from that feeling. And then last bit, sort of little tease on agency and hierarchy. I mean, there's some people that just don't like any hierarchy. It just like, it's kind of a disagreeableness thing, but it's also what can be called demand avoidant, and it's complicated in people's self narratives and that sort of thing. So watch yourself if you're one of those people that you just don't like being told what to do and you chafe. You can end up hurting your own performance because you're not accepting the structures that exist in your organization. So if you have a super dictatorially imposing kind of hierarchy at your workplace, find another job. But if you have a reasonable one, don't watch yourself to not have hang-ups where you just chafe at any kind of direction, because part of moving up an organization is showing that you get the purpose of the organization and that you can act appropriately within it at the various roles and be a good soldier, so to speak. So this is, may or may not be you, but you'll certainly see people that just don't like. There are people that are afraid of their own agency, and there are people that are so agentic. Okay, they're so fixated on full sovereignty, so to speak, that they really chafe and refuse to accept any imposition on their own decision rights, and they just, in some cases, can't even hold down a job, and they have to be self-employed in various ways. And a few of those people go on to become insanely successful, business leaders, because they just had to be in charge all the time. But for everyone that's super successful, there's a lot of them that didn't. So if that's you, before you think you're going to be the next billionaire because you don't like anyone telling you what to do, think long and hard about that. Okay. That's our lecture for today. I went over, but it's a bonus. Love to hear what you thought about it, and remember that these extra credits were very impactful on people's grades for those that made it for their Unit 1 test. So think about it for your Unit 2 test. So we talked about human complexity and performance. We talked about the implicit job. We talked about self-narratives. We talked about productivity, and what that means, and the various ways that it can be sliced and diced. We talked about comparing ourselves to others, and we talked about agency and hierarchy. All right, well, we're going to start Chapter 7 next, and that's training. We're going to talk about what is training, who provides training, what are these things called training objects, how do you train the trainer, what is the pre-training environment, what are different types of training, what's the post-training environment, and then a little bit about how labor shortages are actually driving change in the world of training. All right, that's the lecture for today. I hope it was interesting. Love to hear about it, and we'll see you at the next lecture.